Chapter 16. Battle Instinct. Joe and Sarah returned to the training session without a word to anyone, and everyone present knew them well enough not to ask what had happened. The one possible exception was Wilson himself, but he met Joe's eyes as she stepped back through the door, and understanding passed between them. The two sisters moved to the back of the room and took training in their own direction for the rest of the day. It wasn't clear to Tucker or Jen, but Joe spent that time trying to pin down what might be blocking Sarah's access to her life energy. It was a problem that Joe had never heard of before, and by the time Wilson sent them home for the day, she was just as stumped as she had ever been. "We should talk to Wilson," she told Sarah as they prepared to leave. "I don't want anyone else to know about this," Sarah replied, quickly but quietly. "I'm pretty sure he already knows," Joe insisted, "but he's giving you space to come to him first. If I'm right, he'll bring this up to you himself soon, probably before the end of the week." Sarah looked over at the doorway leading to Wilson's apartment, where he had disappeared at the end of the session after telling them that he expected them back the next day. She considered her sister's suggestion. They didn't have to tell Wilson that Sarah herself couldn't manipulate life energy. They could present it as a general question. It might be the smart thing to do. It might give them the best chance of figuring this all out. Still, she couldn't bring herself to do it. It was still making her stomach ache talking to Joe about it this openly. "I just can't," she said, looking up at her sister with a frown. "Not yet. Let's keep training together until the end of the week, and if Wilson doesn't come to me like you think he will, if you still think we need to, we'll talk to him then." Joe didn't like it. She didn't doubt that she and Sarah could figure this out, but she did doubt that they could do it before the 2 weeks of training were up. Yet she understood where her sister was coming from. Working with her on this problem, even for such a short time, it was perfectly clear just how sore a spot this was. Sarah had stood against her nature for those few hours, fighting her instinct to push back against Joe's input. Sarah didn't know Wilson, so of course she would push back even harder against the idea of him helping her. It was that fact alone that was the only reason why Joe was able to justify waiting. Forcing Sarah to talk to Wilson now would most likely only serve to make the situation more difficult. Joe and Sarah returned home, and Sarah asked their mother to heal her wounds using her Life from the Earth technique. Even though Sarah came prepared to sidestep any questions that her mother might have for her, Shannon didn't make anything of the interaction. She simply healed her daughter and then went on with her life. With that done, the two sisters returned to Wilson's dojo each day for the next several days. Each day, they arrived before the others and trained alone in their own little corner of the training space. Then, once the others had arrived, Wilson would emerge from his apartment, walk to the far end of the room, sit down facing away from his 4 students, and without a word, start meditating, and the 4 dueling hearts would go back to training as he had instructed them. Then, each day, at between 4:30 and 5:30 in the evening, Wilson would stand up carefully and then send the dueling hearts home. At which point, Joe and Sarah would walk to the old park to train for another hour or so before heading home, where Sarah would spend time focusing her energies before bed. She and Joe barely spoke to Jen or Tucker the entire time, and Jen and Tucker noticed, but they were still hesitant to say anything. This routine continued until the end of the week, during which Wilson said nothing to anyone about Sarah's mysterious and persistent inability to control her life energy. In fact, he didn't say anything at all to Joe or Sarah specifically until the very end of the training day on the very last day of that first week. He dismissed the dueling hearts as usual, and Joe and Sarah hung back as Jen and Tucker left. True to her promise, Sarah intended to tell Wilson about her problem and ask for his help. Mysteriously, unlike the previous evenings, Wilson also hung back rather than going immediately to his apartment. As Joe and Sarah approached him, Joe motioning for Sarah to speak, Wilson spoke instead. "Miss Seeger," he said without looking at the two sisters, "remain behind for a moment, if you please." Sarah looked at Joe. She had been right all along. Wilson knew what was going on. Now he intended to confront Sarah about it, and Sarah, being Sarah, wouldn't shy away from whatever criticism the man had to levy against her. She stepped closer to Wilson and stood at something like attention, facing him. But when Wilson turned and saw her, he smiled slightly. "I'm sorry, young lady. I should have been clearer. Joe, please remain behind. Sarah, you may go. I will see you tomorrow." Joe and Sarah locked eyes. They were visibly confused. Sarah turned to Wilson and she asked, "You don't want to talk to me about anything?" "Not particularly," Wilson replied thoughtfully. Sarah was shocked. A bit nonsensically, she saw Wilson's dismissiveness as a slight against her. She wanted to tell him about her lack of ability. She wanted to, in that way, defy him and his expectations. "I have to tell you something," she blurted, and Wilson met her eyes. He was inviting her to speak, and after taking a moment to collect herself, she did. She began, and then hesitated a moment before continuing. "I can't control life energy, or at least I've never been able to. I keep trying. Joe's been helping me, but it hasn't mattered. That's why I can't make an aura, of either kind. Which means that I also lied to you about the healing aura. I never managed to make one, and now I'm worried that I won't be able to figure this out in time for the rematch without your help." By the end of her confession, she was out of breath. Defiant as she was, and stubborn as she was, her reservations hadn't disappeared, and they had weighed her words down. Getting them out had been exhausting, but now that they were out, Sarah felt relieved. She felt like she had cast off a heavy load. She waited, almost eagerly, to hear Wilson's response, and she was genuinely surprised when Wilson smiled warmly and said, "I know. I've known since you lied about the life energy aura, and I've suspected for quite some time prior. However, and I know that Joe agrees with me, I consider you to be an extremely talented fighter. Continue to work as you have been, and I'm sure that when you most need the skills that I've been teaching you, you'll be able to make use of them." Sarah didn't know what to say. She barely knew Wilson, and already he was so confident in her abilities. She looked at Joe and saw that Joe was beaming at her. "Wilson knows what he's talking about," Joe assured her sister. "If he thinks our training is going to do the trick, then it will." She put her arm around her sister's shoulders. "See, I told you telling him would be okay." "Of course," Wilson told them both. "I did ask to speak with one of you." The sisters had almost forgotten. If Wilson didn't want to talk to Sarah, then he wanted to talk to Joe. Joe stepped up next to Sarah and faced Wilson formally, as she always did when she was taking Wilson's instruction. She waited for Wilson to speak to her, to reveal why she had been asked to stay, but instead he spoke to Sarah again. "I'm sorry, but I need to talk to your sister alone," he announced. Joe and Sarah were confused, but they didn't argue. They parted company, and Sarah made her way toward home. Immediately, once Sarah was through the door and the door had swung shut behind her, Joe spoke to her teacher in the casual way that she always did when the two were alone. "I appreciate you saying that to her, Will," she said. "But are you sure she doesn't need your help on this one? I've been trying to help, and I'm stumped. Neither of us has ever heard of someone with this problem." "Frankly," Wilson replied, "I'm less concerned with her problem than I am yours." His words were not casual. He wasn't speaking to Joe as a friend, as he had the day of her last sparring match with Keith. He was speaking to her with authority. He was speaking to her as a teacher. This caught Joe's full attention in an instant, making her aware of just how serious this talk was going to be. She faced Wilson, trying her best not to look or sound offended, as she asked, "What problem?" "Don't misunderstand me," Wilson explained. "I'm not insulting you. Like your sister, you are exceptionally gifted. I would say that your potential greatly outstrips hers. In fact, I would say that it outstrips many of the greatest fighters that I've encountered. But the fact of the matter is that there is something holding you back. It's something that you would have eventually outgrown on your own, I'm sure of that, but you no longer have the time. The Soul Taker who you fought," he explained, "the girl named Karen, is incredibly powerful. I have known fighters who trained all of their adult lives who would commit unspeakable acts for the power that that girl wields. As you are, you simply cannot defeat her." "Isn't that why you taught us how to make a healing aura?" Joe asked, confused. "And why you taught us how to sense people with life energy? To counter Karen's advantage?" "In part," Wilson agreed, "yes, and I still believe that those lessons, combined with a bit of good old grit and cleverness, will be enough for the others to close the gaps between themselves and their opponents. But you and Karen are another story altogether." He began to pace the room. "I'm sure you noticed how easily Karen was able to pick up on your practice forms and use them to predict how you would attack. That is an exceptional skill, and you made a valiant attempt to counter it by moving more randomly, by shaking up how you attack, but such a tactic will never work for the simple reason that you, Joanna Seeger, think too much." Joe was stunned silent. She blinked 3 full times before finally responding with a flat, "What?" "Don't get me wrong," Wilson explained. "Tactics are important in combat, but in the heat of battle you have a bad habit of allowing your conscious mind to direct your actions on even a moment-to-moment basis. That's why just knowing your forms was so effective a counter against you. You're far too skilled for that. A fighter of your level should fight by allowing their body to move on instinct." "But I do," Joe protested. "You think you do," Wilson argued, "but there's a pattern to your movements. You're like a student reciting mathematics tables. There are certain few sequences of movements that you progress through, that you've memorized. You alternate between them very effectively, but that's not enough. That's not why a fighter practices forms. Their intention is for their body to learn and memorize them. Their body, not their mind. You have made strides already to overcome this weakness," Wilson continued. "Your shadow step is already a start. It's a brilliant technique, genius even. I have hardly ever known anyone to so perfectly harness the inherent properties of their specific soul. It makes you fast enough that the average fighter would never notice your weak battle instincts, but Karen is not average. Additionally," he added, "I have seen you use Shadow Step often enough to recognize its weakness. I know that you are unable to reliably attack while moving. Against someone like Karen who can read you so well, this only makes you vulnerable." Joe frowned and struggled not to look away from her mentor. He had gone from criticizing her to dissecting her best technique and diagnosing the one weakness that she had thought no one had been able to reason out, none of which was easy for her to hear. He wasn't finished yet, either. Weakness or no weakness, though, Wilson concluded, your shadow step acts as a potent boost to your already impressive speed. As quickly as you're able to move, whether she knows your forms or not, Karen should not be able to predict your movements well enough to stay so far ahead of you. Your body should be able to use those forms as a guideline to move and counter her. And you're saying that I can't do that, Joe said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of realization. I'm not saying that you can't, Wilson told her, any more than I would claim that your sister's current inability to tap one of her energies means that she never will. But I am saying that you don't. You started to, toward the end of your fight, but even then you still relied only on your most practiced movements. You simply shuffled them around a bit. Wilson stopped pacing and met Joe's eyes. Again, he said, I think that this is a problem that you would have outgrown in time, but you don't have that luxury any longer. You must learn to trust your instincts, to surrender the wheel to them, if you will. If you do, your regular techniques will no longer be useless against Karen. She'll still be able to keep up with you uncommonly well, but she'll also, finally, have to take you seriously. You don't think she was... No, I don't think she was taking you seriously, Wilson interjected, not for 1 second during the entire fight. Sarah's opponent, at the end, was taking her seriously. Jen and Tucker's opponent, after being trapped by Jen's gravity, started to take the two of them seriously. But Karen toyed with you the entire time. Joe didn't know how to react to that. She was just as surprised as one might expect, but she also felt something else. Hurt, maybe? But that didn't make sense. Still, she trusted Wilson's eye. She trusted that he knew what he was talking about. It was clear now that Wilson had seen much more of the fight between the Dueling Hearts and the Soul Takers than he had let on, but that didn't matter. Joe had to defeat Karen. If Wilson was right and Karen was even more powerful than she had let on, then Joe didn't think that anyone else could face her and win. It certainly wasn't because the idea that Karen didn't take her seriously was getting to her, or the realization that she wanted to impress the Soul Taker. As soon as those ideas entered her mind, Joe dismissed them for being ridiculous. Joe was shaken. Her entire view of herself had changed, but she was Joe Seeger. She didn't back down from an opponent, even if that opponent was herself. She looked her teacher in the eyes, and she asked, Okay, then how do we fix me? Wilson smiled. This attitude of Joe's was the thing he most admired about her. It won't be easy, he answered. You'll have to come in an hour and a half early and stay an hour late, each day for the next week. We'll spar. You will not be permitted to use soul or soul abilities of any kind, while I will be able to use the soul that I have built up through this week's meditation in order to keep ahead of you. I will push you harder than you have ever been pushed before until you have learned to divorce logic from the actions of your body while fighting. Joe had her concerns. She had never sparred with Wilson before. Even as powerful as he had recently revealed himself to be, she was worried about hurting him. She was also worried about adding so much more training to her day, and what this added training with Wilson would mean for her training with Sarah. But she didn't object. Instead, she looked her teacher in the eyes, her gaze sparkling with determination, and she nodded. Wilson smiled. Good. In that case, we begin now. Without another word of warning, without a moment's hesitation, he attacked. This was not training to overcome the limits of her body. Joe was used to training like that. No, this was training to overcome the limits of her mind, and in many ways it was the hardest training of Joe's life.